Good evening, everyone. We have arrived in Daniel chapter 7. Now, Daniel chapter 7 is still written in the Aramaic language, which gives us from chapter 2, verse 4, all the way to this chapter. By the end of this chapter, the Aramaic language will end. Now, Daniel chapter 7 is the beginning when it is written in the first person in the way Daniel speaks in chapter 7 and in verse 2. We'll get there. Now, what's important for us to then understand in chapter 7 onwards is that we are entering into some of the most difficult passages in the book of Daniel. The first difficult passage was in Daniel chapter 2, when Nebuchadnezzar had started to have a dream that was a communication by God to Nebuchadnezzar about the future. And the response by Nebuchadnezzar is that in chapter 3, he makes himself an image of gold instead of the head of gold. Now, we have gone past that, and now we are beginning to see in the later period of the exile, and Daniel is growing older from Daniel chapter 2. Remember, in Daniel chapter 2, we are talking about a 2 year after Daniel had been taken into exile. He's been learning the Chaldean language, and probably in the age of maybe 15 years. Now, we are entering into the later phases of his life. In Daniel chapter 7, we are told, and remember, Daniel, when it's written in the book of Aramaic, does not use Hebrew narrative styles. It's very specific. We begin a brand new segment. And from Daniel chapter 7, we begin to see that the book of Daniel is not written in a chronological fashion. The first 6 chapters is laid out in a chronology from start to finish, from chapter 1, after that, chapter 2. And then when we get to chapter 6, it is the first year of the reign of Darius. Now, when we come to chapter 7, we begin to read in the first year of Belshazzar, the king of Babylon. Remember, Belshazzar is the son of the king. And we saw that in Daniel chapter 5. In Daniel chapter 5, it speaks of Belshazzar. And at the end of chapter 5, we read the fall of Babylon. And so when we talk about Daniel chapter 7, verse 1, in the first year of Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, we are now mindful that Daniel chapter 7, which is this chapter, is before Daniel chapter 5. Before. So it takes place in between chapter 4 and chapter 5. Because Daniel chapter 6 is after Daniel chapter 5. Now, you might think this is confusing, but it is only purely to help us understand that Daniel chapter 7 is spoken or is written at a time before Daniel chapter 5, before the fall of Babylon, which means that Daniel chapter 7 is in the Babylonian era. It is in the Babylonian Empire. And that's why we say Belshazzar is the king of Babylon. Daniel chapter 6, on the other hand, is Darius. And he is the Mede from Madai. No, it is the Mede side of the Medo-Persian kingdom. And so we need to bear in mind the timing. And so in our study, we are mindful that this is before Daniel chapter 5. Now, this happened at the time of the Babylonian Empire, very much corresponding to Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2, where he had the metallic image in his dream, the head of shoulders of gold, the chest and the arms of silver, the belly and the thighs of copper, and the two legs of iron, and the feet and the 10 toes is iron mixed with miry clay. Now, that is the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. Daniel chapter 7, many, many years down the road, God gave Daniel a similar dream, meaning a dream with similar messaging, but the dream is different in its composition. We will engage with the composition in the text so that we understand what the text is actually saying. See, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind. Now, this word mind is really mind as the head. It's not mind as the heart. It's mind as the head, meaning in his thoughts, he is seeing a dream and visions. Now, sometimes you might think that these are two and the same. It's not. The dream is when you have drifted into sleep. The visions is when you are about to sleep, but you are no longer in the state of awakeness. In both cases, they are mechanisms where God communicates with humans, generally with people he wants to speak to. For example, the prophets see visions. They also hear of dreams. But God does communicate, say, with the Pharaoh, with Nebuchadnezzar in a dream. So more dream than vision. But in this case, in Daniel, he's got both vision and dreams, being that there is a lot of communication as he laid on his bed. So it would have been a night time. That's what we say this. This is night time. Else he won't be sleeping and having dreams. And the moment he had this dream, we read this. Then. Now understand, in Aramaic, then is really the and then in the Hebrew. But it's a specific word. After he had captured the dream and the visions in his head, he quickly woke up and wrote down the dream. And then he told the summary of it. Now, this word summary literally means uh, the highlights. The reason I call it highlights is that he is not telling everything about the dream, but he is telling the main points of the dream. The details of the dream is actually left out in this chapter. Remember, it is still in the book written as Aramaic. And the reason why it was written in Aramaic is because he is still in the Babylonian Empire. He's still in the Babylonian era, where the Chaldean language will be primary. As he wrote this down, he is being described not by himself in the first two verses, because the first two verses is commonly understood not written by Daniel, because it talks about Daniel said. What does that mean? It means from Daniel chapter 7 and in verse 1 and in verse 2 up to this point, it was completely written by the men of the great assembly. So let me just put this down. there is a group of people called the men of the Great Assembly. Now, who are these men? These are men from after the exile. It is post exile. And the men from the Great Assembly will include people like Daniel. It will include people like Ezra, Nehemiah. These are very important people. It would include people like Haggai, as well as Zechariah. These are the prophets. It will include Mordecai from the book of Esther, Zerubbabel, and these are the major names called the men of the Great Assembly. And these were the ones who would compile the book of Daniel, and they put in all of the 7 chapters or 6 chapters plus 2 verses in Aramaic. And the reason we say that is because it's written in the third person. Third person means it is not Daniel speaking, but written about what Daniel said. And so these are things that were written about Daniel in the form of a conversation in Aramaic at the time of after the Babylonian exile. Now, the men of the Great Assembly is a very important group of people who actually compiled with Ezra the Tanakh as we know it, as well as many of these books that needed to be completed, like the book of Daniel. But from Daniel chapter 7, verse 2, reading from this point, I was looking in my vision by night, tells us that this is nighttime, and it's only nighttime that you dream and sleep. And behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. What we need to talk about is this. The important thing of chapter 7 and reading from verse 2. This is called a night vision. And this word by night literally means the dream scenario. The dream scenario is night as well. And so now we've got 2 important concepts. It was nighttime when Daniel had his dream, right? And Daniel dreamt. And in his dream, it is night. And so let's not be confused here. There are 2 instances of night. The time he dreamt was night. Inside the dream is also night. And this is what it means here. I was looking in my vision, and it was nighttime. It was during the night in that sense. You know, the vision is about a nighttime. Now, that we are entering into what we call a lot of speculative interpretation. And so I want to be very clear as we go through from Daniel chapter 7 onwards, where it has a lot to do with dreams, visions, prophecies of the time that came after, of the end times. All of these have to be very carefully understood. My objective as we study the book of Daniel is number 1, we want to understand the Aramaic text here as well as eventually the Hebrew text from chapter 8 onwards. We want to know what the text actually said. Then we would apply what I would call interpretation of the events of the dreams. Now, the interpretation is the one that we cannot be ultimately dogmatic about. But what we can do is that we can have very good speculation, very intelligent assertions, where we can know by a high probability these would be how most people would understand. And I want to show you the Jewish view of things so that you don't have to do your research. And then you can compare to any other studies that you may encounter. And so I want to leave this up front so that we don't misunderstand each other, that I'm trying to give you the understanding of the text in the Aramaic and later on in the Hebrew. And then once you understand the text, then you would appreciate what it's trying to say. We are going to approach chapter 7 onwards a bit slower than normal. And so he is looking at this night vision and says the four winds of heaven. This is not four winds. This is the four, how should we say, the four divine beings. I will call it divine beings. This is not the wind as we know it, not the north, south, east, west wind. This is the four ruach. The four ruach could be also translated as the four spirits in the skies. And we are beginning to see that from the book of Daniel onwards, that this is happening at the night time, which the Jews tend to see this as exile. It is at the time of the exile, the time where the Jewish people are not in their own kingdom. The Jewish people do not have their kings. And so, in the Jewish mind, that is nighttime. When the Messiah or the Mashiach comes to install their kingdom, to restore the kingdom, that would be daytime. And so we're still talking about a nighttime where the kingdom is not the kingdom that belongs to the Jews. And so at the same time, the four winds, or the four divine beings, or the four spirits in heaven were stirring the great sea. This is an imagery. It is stroking, and by stroking, it is causing the sea of the Mediterranean Sea. The Mediterranean Sea is called the Great Sea, but it is also symbolic. It is trying to show us in an imagery view that there are four spirit beings and they are stirring hard the Great Sea, the Mediterranean Sea. This is an important aspect when we enter into chapter 7. Remember, we're talking about dreams and visions. We're not talking about actual events. Because they are not actual events, the Hebrew language and the Aramaic language are very concrete languages. They will still use concrete words to describe visions and dreams that is in the mind. But sometimes you need to understand when things are happening in the mind, it doesn't necessarily need to follow the natural realm events. Things can happen in the dream, and you can see things in the dream that does not need to exist in real life, but the language will use real life things that we know and try to explain the dreams in those terms. The Aramaic language and the Hebrew language. And these kinds of people, the Hebrew people, they don't invent words to use. They will use concrete language to describe abstract visions. And so from verse 2 onwards, I hope you begin to see, once we understand the words, then we will try to understand the image that it paints. And in our image in verse 2, we are looking at four divine beings flying here and there, maybe having a great big soup spoons, and they are stirring the great sea like soup. And what it does convey is this: the great sea, if you recall the book of Jonah, when instead of going to Nineveh, he went into the great sea towards Tarshish, and he engaged and met with great storms. Storms happens in the great sea. It doesn't happen in the Sea of Galilee, which is a freshwater lake. And so in the Mediterranean Sea now, in verse 2, it's in a dream. It's in a great body of water. It is turbulent. It is unexplainable turbulence, but you are seeing the image of four spirit beings flying back and forth, having a great big soup spoon each, stirring the sea in a very harsh manner. Now, if you take one step back, then you are beginning to see this vision that Daniel is seeing, that it is going to tell Daniel that times are going to be very tough. If you think the times were tough when the Assyrians came and when the Babylonians came, times will be even worse because of what the four spirit beings are doing to the sea. It is going to be turbulent, and this is what Daniel saw. Now, this is the words that's coming out in the Aramaic. I'm just trying to bring out the life of the text. The English text does not really give us a good, clear view, but I'm trying to help us visualize the dream. Verse 3. Verse 3 says this: in that dream in the sea, four great beasts were coming up from it. This is the Mediterranean Sea, the Great Sea. So let us be mindful. What the way that is being expressed is very Eastern. It goes one after another. After you have the dreams introduction, then what happened next is that four great beasts were coming out from the sea, and it says it's different from one another. Let me begin to draw the dream. So understand that this is the picture of the sea, and we would find four spirit beings. So I draw four spirit beings. And the four spirit beings hold stir sticks, and they are stirring the sea. Please understand, all these things can happen in a dream. And with this picture, then Daniel chapter 7, verse 3 begins to show up. It says here, and four, and this is four individual, and it says here, great. Now, the idea of great is not many, this is big. Four big beasts. Now, this word beast is the Aramaic equivalent of haya, meaning they were animals or wild animals, which is commonly translated. The wild animals were big. Now, why did Daniel call them wild animals? Because they appear in the dream as big wild animals. That's all it says. It hasn't described the animals, but all we need to know is that they are animals. They are not humans. That's opposed to human. That's what we need to see. They are great because they are big. They are four in number, and they came up from the sea, which means that it is this sea that is turbulent, and out it came. Now, where did it come out? When it says it comes out, we may have to imagine that we have the beach, the land. And so they will come up to the land. The sea represents the world, and the land represents the people of the world. And this would be a picture, a very Eastern picture. And they come out, four of them. Now, I don't draw four of them right now because it will be described in the following verses. But in verse 3, we are also told one particular word which I really want us to be very clear. And this word is different. The word different here is not that it looks different, but it is transforming from one to another. So there is an idea of transformation. There is an idea of change. Meaning, the first beast that comes out, we call it A. It has an ability to then change to B. And then it changes to C. And then it changes to D. Now, these are the transformation and change. This is what it means. It is important as a word to understand because it is giving us a picture that A comes out and somehow it appears to become B. And then from B, it transforms itself to become C. And then it transforms itself to become D. That is what it means. And each of them is different because it changed. That's why the translation used the word different because it has transformed. The transformation is the key because A to B, B is not A, but B came from A, but it doesn't look like A. B becomes C, it changes to become C, but it is not C. C is very different from B. That is what this word different actually means. Although you look at them, they are four different beasts because it talks about four different beasts. It didn't come out from the sea four at the same time. It came out as one, and then it became the second, and then it became the third, and then it became the fourth. This is what this verse actually means. We are not seeing four beasts coming out from the sea at the same time. Remember, it is coming out from the sea. It is not swimming in the sea. That's another key that we need to remember because they actually come out from the sea to the land. That is the imagery. Now, obviously, you know that when you have a dream, you're not recording the dream in a video. The Eastern people lived at a time when there was no video, but they were very good storytellers. And they would choose their words and they would describe the story one after another so that you can follow the storyline in your head. And so the words become very important. If we don't understand the words, then we don't know how to play back the idea of the dream and vision in our head. I hope by the time we get to verse 3, you already have a picture of how to approach chapter 7. and then eventually chapter 8 and 9 and 10 and 11, because it is about a storytelling style. In chapter 7, it is a dream, it is a vision, and it's about things that you don't normally see on the land. And so the only way to describe what you don't see on the land, but in your head, in the dream and vision, is to use those things that we see on land and word it in a way to describe it is like that, but not quite, but it has this. And I hope that you begin to appreciate from verse 4 when Daniel begins to describe each of the wild beasts. Understand this, these wild beasts are not the normal wild beasts that is in the land. They are wild beasts in the dream. And in the dream, it is nothing like what he has ever seen before. But how do you describe what nobody has seen before? It's impossible. And so the only way is to use the language and the vocabulary of this period. And that these are the things that they would normally see. But then you would use those things that you normally see to then form words and ideas and combine these ideas to describe what is in your head, in the mind. And so Daniel is trying to give us today a picture of what was in his mind or in his head. That is very difficult because there is no video recording. And the only way is he woke up very quickly and he wrote this down, and then he told the summary, and we are reading the summary, the highlights of his dream. With this said, I hope that we are very mindful that we need to sit down, and when we read Daniel chapter 7, as we go through the study, we want to visualize it in our head so that we can attempt to see what Daniel is seeing in his dream. And when we can achieve this objective through the Aramaic language, and we understand the principle of storytelling in an Eastern world, and we are looking at the things we understand, but Daniel is describing things that we have never ever seen. Then, when we piece it in our minds, we will have an easier time to interpret some of these things. Albeit we're now in the 21st century, we are still left with the dream highlights in chapter 7 of the book of Daniel. And so now, at this introduction of verse 2 and 3, in our minds, we are seeing what Daniel is seeing. We have nighttime. We have the great sea. It is very turbulent. There are 4 spirit beings with great big soup spoons, and they are stirring up a storm in the great sea. Verse 3. Then Daniel says there were 4 great big animals, if you like, monsters that came up from the sea. And when it came up from the sea, it has to come onto the land. And each of them transform into another, and each is different, which means that B is not equal to A. B comes from A, but it looks very different from A. That is what this word different actually means. And so there are 4 processes, meaning it is one after another. It is not 4 happening at the same time. And it is happening towards the later years of the life of Daniel. Probably add another 60 years to him. He is in his 70s. And he is very sharp, and he is writing this down, and it is terrifying him. And with this, we come to the end of our session to introduce the dream and visions of Daniel in chapter 7.